Next up, we have Dan Toda of Durante, Bach and Toda. Dan is engaged in the representation of individual and commercial clients across several practice areas. He generally handles transactional cases involving real estate finance, business formations and transfers, and landlord and tenant matters. He is also involved with the prosecution, negotiation, and defense of claims arising from these cases. Mr. Toda is responsible for the firm's management and business affairs. Dan Toda.
Thank you. So I'm a lawyer across the street, okay? And probably the most disliked member of the panel. I get it, I know. So let me talk to you first a little bit about my firm in seriousness. I'm a partner at the firm, and I handle most of the real estate and the finance matters. But my firm has 7 attorneys. We handle a lot of family law, estate planning, civil litigation, real property issues, just about everything. So we see it all, and we've unfortunately dealt with it all. So these days, we have a number of misconceptions about these real estate transactions, and I think that the biggest one is that it's easy. It's not always easy. These deals these days are like obstacle courses, and we're constantly dealing with things that come up, and we do our best throughout the process to flush out some of these issues early on so we can deal with them. But despite that, things sometimes do come up that we have to deal with through the course of the transaction. So timing would be the first one. I think that's the general misconception these days, and present company accepted. Most banks are doing deals now 60 days, plus minus, easy. There are new laws that went into effect October of 2015, and the industry is still dealing with that. Things are taking longer. These bank applications are generally difficult, and we're seeing the frustration from the buyers and also from the sellers because, of course, it doesn't do anyone any good unless that money is at the table. So that's the first one, the timing. The second one has to do with clearance, because all of these deals, most of these deals, require that you have clean title and you have a legalized property. And when these deals are negotiated, there are certain presumptions that the buyers, sellers, and agents make when they're putting the deal together. We've heard someone say something about as is. Every deal is as is. When an offer is accepted, it's as is, as is. What does that mean? Okay, when it gets to my desk, we have to flush it out because we have to put the actual detailed term in the contract. As is a reference to the physical condition of the home. But, and here's the big but, appliances, mechanical systems, utility systems have to be in working order. The house has to be legalized, and the seller has to have good title to convey at closing. So those things are also based in the customary contract that we use in this area. So as is only goes so far, because without those other items, most buyers don't buy and most sellers don't sell. Of course, especially when there's a bank in the transaction. So what happens? There's a problem. Pick up the phone, call the seller. We have a title problem. We have a building department problem. If I had a penny for every time I heard, I bought the house like that. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how you bought the house. Things change. Building departments, procedures change, the laws change. I don't know who represented you when you purchased and how detailed they were and how much due diligence you went through. You could have a finished basement without a CO. You could have a shed. You could have a deck that was added on. You could have an old mortgage that was never paid off. You could have Aunt Sally that never got her interest addressed in an estate proceeding 10 years ago. These things happen. No one knows about them up front. We have to wait for a title report to come in. Hopefully we'll have a realtor that goes to the building department and checks these things in advance. But not all realtors are the same. We have very good ones, and just like every industry, we have poor ones, attorneys, bankers included, okay? So these are things that come up and they have to be dealt with. They cause timing problems. And when people have practical life circumstances that they have to deal with, whether it's moving out of state, maybe buying a different property, maybe it's a school district and getting a child in school before the year starts, these are things that come up that have to be addressed. So you want to make sure you keep your title insurance policy. You want to make sure you go down to the building department, check, and understand exactly what you have in your home to deal with things in advance so they don't come up at the worst possible time in a transaction when we have things expiring. So that's something else that you guys should be aware of. The title issues and the municipal issues with the building department, these are things that are complicated these days. They're ever changing, and like everything else in this world, it's more difficult than it used to be, right? So those things are coming up. Lastly, I would tell you that you should be aware of some of the standard contract conditions, okay? We're talking about a condition that a buyer has to obtain a mortgage before they can close the deal, and that perhaps a buyer has to sell their home before they can buy another home, okay? These are conditions that we talk about generally early on in a transaction, but they're difficult, and it's really interesting to flush out the details of what that condition means. Most buyers and sellers think that a deal is conditioned on getting a loan and getting the money to the table, and that's not the case. Buyers have about 30 to 40 days to get a commitment letter from a bank, which is a promise that the bank is going to give them a loan. The condition only relates to that commitment letter. So after that commitment letter is issued, if something happens to that buyer, a job loss, an adverse change of their financial circumstances, that means that they don't get the loan and they also don't get their down payment back. Problem for a buyer, also a problem for a seller, because a seller doesn't want a down payment. A seller wants to sell their house. So that's one thing that you really have to speak to your banker about up front, to make sure that once that commitment letter is issued, that the buyer is comfortable in their ability to ultimately get that loan, because they're not protected in the normal contract. The other thing that I'm sure that the realtors can speak to is how difficult it is to negotiate a sale condition in a contract, so that a buyer's obligation to purchase is conditioned on their ability to sell their home. We talked about a transition before, selling one property and buying another property. Sale condition is very difficult to get into a contract because it's risky for the seller, and it's not something that all buyers need. So if that's going to be an issue, either to get your loan or to get your purchase, you have to be aware of it up front. You have to deal with it up front so you know what your risks are. Last thing I will just speak to is confidentiality. That is another misconception that's generally glossed over, but it's very important. For any of the realtors in the room, what happens when your seller tells you that the basement is full of mold?
We take out that in paper.
Follow-up question. What happens when the buyer's agent asks you if there's any mold in the house?
Are we aware of it? You have to disclose it.
They have to disclose it, okay? So you have to be careful what you say to people. And you have to understand that things that you may say that are seemingly harmless may come back and hurt you. When you tell a seller when your rate's expiring, when you tell a buyer that it's really important that you move because of whatever's going on. You know, these are things that can be used throughout the process to negotiate against you. And you have to understand that depending on who you're talking to, you might not be protected by privileged or confidential information. So just something to be aware of. You should be getting a disclosure from your agents up front that tells you who they're working for, who they're representing. If they're not representing you, of course, there are going to be different levels of confidentiality and disclosure requirements and things like that. But know who you're talking to. Be careful what you say, because things that may seem innocent and innocuous and passive at the beginning of a transaction may turn out to be harmful to you later on in the transaction. So just have a general awareness of that. And that's it. Any questions, or I guess we'll just open it up to questions at the end? Okay, thank you.